but the two separate business meetings were actually addressing very similar issues, but they wanted to be sure the women had a voice. However, somebody pointed out that the men always took care of the money.
I was thinking people should talk a little bit about their alternative service work where they served, and then the spouse's experience of being in the community.
I was 18 during the war, and the American Friends Service Committee and the peace churches had made an agreement with the selected service to take care of conscientious objectors. And this was a great step forward, and we were all enthusiastic about it. And as we got drafted, we pretty nearly automatically went to civilian public service. And that was a whole bunch of projects, often in old CCC camps to start with, but it branched out to hospitals and other types of projects. I spent time in the Great Smoky National Park for a while, and I was at Trenton, which was a Bureau Reclamation project, and I was at Glendora Side Camp, which was a fire crew in the San Bernardino forests. And I finished up at Independence State Hospital, and there was one guinea pig experiment, pneumonia experiment, while I was at Gatlinburg. The doctors at Fort Bragg wanted some guinea pigs to see if they could figure out how virus pneumonia was getting moved around. And that's too long a story to tell.
Maybe you want Horace in the same generation.
Well, okay.
Is this the topic about
CPS.
civilian public service? I'm Horace Autenrieth. I was in college when at the Quaker College in Oskaloosa, Iowa, when World War II began. I remember Pearl Harbor. I was walking home from church, Quaker church, that morning, and somebody called out from a house on the sidewalk where we were walking and said that Pearl Harbor's been bombed. And I knew then that my life was going to be different than I had planned. I was continued with some, I think my draft board in O'Brien County was reluctant to draft me because they didn't want to have, as I understood it, they didn't want to have conscientious objectors coming from their county. But it meant then that if they didn't, when my number came up, if they didn't take my number, it meant that somebody else had to meet that quota from O'Brien County. So it became a rather unpopular position for deferring conscientious objectors. Finally, they started deferring some of us in college that had been just overlooked, sort of. And that went on until I was about a month from my second year. I had invested that semester and looked like I was going to be drafted before I take my finals and wouldn't get credit. So I hitchhiked home to see a member of the draft board, which later became my neighbor, and told him that I would appreciate it if I could have a month's deferment until I could finish college and get credit. And I told him I don't really think it'll make any difference to the war effort, whether I'm drafted or not. And kind of shuffled his feet and said, no, he didn't think he would either, and I did get a deferment. Later, he became my good neighbor. But the draft board itself, I understood, was pretty obstinate about conscious objectors. I think that was because my draft board viewed other Quakers. That particular member of the draft board, so he had 2 sons in the Air Force. I was then assigned to the same camp that Don Mott was in North Dakota. We did earth moving for irrigation purposes and for drainage along Mississippi, along the Missouri River. And winters were cold. The pay was about $2.50 a month. And the second winter, I thought maybe I could find something that would be more useful, and volunteered for working in a mental hospital in Philadelphia, a very large mental hospital. It had the additional advantage that it was near a college girl that I was engaged to, and she finished college and moved to Philadelphia where we were married. At the end of near the end of the war, conscious objectors were allowed then to go outside of the United States, which that's kind of an interesting story. Early on in the formation of selective service programs for conscious objectors, there was a program for relief and rehabilitation for people in other countries that the selective service system allowed, and there was a unit of select civilian public service volunteers that were on a ship to India. Most of them were specialists in city planning, in language, and teaching, and in medicine. And there were 100 men on a ship on the way to India that had been drafted. They were conscious objectors, and the ship stopped in South Africa and there got a message that they were to return to the United States because a Southern congressman had got a law passed that no conscious objectors would be allowed outside of the United States during wartime. And that was a great disappointment to these idealistic fellows that had, most of them had graduate degrees. And they were sent back up to Michigan where they planted trees individually in cold climate, very kind of demeaning work for them. But aside from that, at the end of World War II, conscious objectors were also drafted for what they called the duration plus 6 months. They didn't want conscious objectors being returned to the workforce in competition with the release of soldiers coming back. There were actually millions of young men that were coming back into the workforce, and they wanted to delay the conscious objectors by at least 6 months. So during that time, I was still under the care of the selective service system, but was allowed then to accompany livestock shipments to Europe under the auspices of the American Friends of the Brethren Service Committee and the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Act. So I had a nice experience taking first about 350 horses to, along with several other Mennonites and Quakers, to Poland, And then later, 99 horses to Greece and Cyprus. That experience overseas and seeing the conditions of people following World War II and the strife that they had been subjected to made quite an impression on me, so that when I became eligible to retire from farming here in this community, my wife and I volunteered for some work overseas, and the American Friends Service Committee sent us to one of their programs in the Middle East, where we worked for 3 years. I attributed that volition to that experience I had following World War II while I was in the selective service system.
I'm GalenTjossem. I registered as a pacifist during the Korean War and finally got my notice to report to Iowa Methodist Hospital in Des Moines for an interview, which worked out, and I said, when am I to start? And they said, Monday morning. So I packed up and started work in that recovery room, helping with patients and the supplies and whatnot around the hospital. Worked there for about a year. And then I was asked if I would take the position as orderly in the recovery room. And that was a more interesting job, and worked into meeting my future wife there. When I started, there was over 40 COs working at Iowa Methodist Hospital, and I imagine when I left there was well over 30 yet. And Jim Mott was another one that served his time at Iowa Methodist. That's about all right.
Were you the only two from this community there then?
What's that?
Were you the only two there?
Well, Archie
From here.
Newland was moved to Ohio, but served through O'Brien County, and Clarence Gisem registered as a conscientious objector, and because of his girlfriend decided he would go into the service. I think that's about it of my age.
My brother Roland, even though he would have been classified as unfit physically because he was missing a hand, he volunteered during the Korean War, and he and his wife were sent to Japan to work with a youth camp in Japan for 2 years.
So what were the women doing while that you guys were working together then, basically?
Yeah, I worked together with different student nurses. They had 2 weeks in the recovery room, each one. Two nurses would, student nurses would work in the recovery room for 2 weeks. So I met a lot of student nurses there.
Only one good one, though.
Jim got his wife down there on that.
That's the one a little later on.
Yeah,
It's
that's
part of
It's part of the story.
Yeah.
Well, I wasn't married during CPS, but right afterwards I got interested in being married and got back with Lizzie and we were married pretty soon. So she wasn't involved in the CPS thing. Then the draft law of 48 come along, and at the end of CPS, the 6 months Horace talked about was very bad for morale, and a lot of people were walking out, and I thinking about that. I don't think I think I said this at a group, I wouldn't do CPS again. I didn't think that was going to be so consequential, but then I was required to register for the draft, and Roy Knight and Horace Autenrieth and I happened to be in the same time group, and were tried and sent to prison for 8 out of 18-month sentence. No, that wasn't quite all. When we left prison, they registered us automatically, sent the papers to the draft board, and the draft board came at us again. And this was really a pretty tense time because we were married, 2 of us had children, and we went back to the courthouse, and Addison Parker, attorney from Des Moines, was able to convince the prosecuting attorney and the judge that it wasn't a good idea to disrupt us anymore, and so we were sent back home, kind of mysteriously. Our parents, I remember my mother asking, would I care if she gave them my birthday? I was too old by then, and my marriage status and stuff the draft board needed to know.